Ha, ha.
Fields of swords, field of wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and place, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Well, it's commencement day here at Troy University on the Troy campus. Of course, we have multiple campuses and we have different commencement days. We also have them staggered throughout the year. So there are, I think, 9 commencements through the year. No, there may be 12. There are a lot of commencement ceremonies that we have. And so faculty do not like going to them. We're usually forced at gunpoint to go to them because for you, they're very exciting. For us, we're sitting through basically the same boring speeches and hearing people's names read over and over again. But the pomp and the circumstance are important. This year, however, I was freed from it. However, I still had some students who asked if they could take pictures with me afterwards. So I am just waiting now for the commencement ceremony to finish so that I can take pictures. Now, before we get into the topic today, the elephant in the room, what's this? Well, as a medieval scholar, I decided to get rid of the normal kind of TAM or mortarboard, and instead use a medieval style one. So the kind that you use if you're an undergrad comes from this kind. This is called a chaperone. This is 14th century style. Has a huge coxcomb on top, which would be the norm. This is probably the point at which they were the most audacious. And the tassels got to be very long. In fact, my tassel's so long, I just drape it over my shoulder because it's so unbelievably long. And so I teach medieval lit, so I have a medieval style chaperone, which I normally wear to commencement. So that's what this is all about. Okay, so this is a subject that I really hadn't given a lot of thought to doing a netcast about, but it's a constant, perennial conversation that I have with friends. And a few weeks ago, a friend of mine suggested, after we'd talked about this for some time, he said, you should do a cast on this. And so it is. And this is, a series which should get a reboot. Now, let me be clear what the parameters are for this. I'm not saying you'll notice these are all science fiction because I know my audience, you bunch of nerds. The other element of this is I'm not looking for things which were good and I just want to see more of. That is part of it sometimes, but sometimes in looking at things which were not good and could be better. Also, I think there are some things on this list which don't work, which the older versions might be good, but they don't work well in the era of bingeable series. You'll notice that there are only TV series here because part of what I'm looking for here are things which would just be better in a kind of bingeable form. Okay, so these are my self-set parameters. These are the kinds of things that normally come up. And so you'll notice that most of them, some of them are quite old, but most of them come from around the 90s. A few a little bit later or are a little bit earlier, but mostly around the 90s. And I think the reason for that is that, honestly, because anything that's older than that tends to either already have been rebooted in some way or have essentially spawned its own genre of its own subgenre of types of things. So, for example, Star Trek. I have in my mind some kind of ideals of what Star Trek would look like today, which is not the Orville, nor is it anything else which is being done that would be the ideal for me. But it isn't like anyone's not trying to do that. So let's talk about So I'm leaving some of those things out also, because they basically have spawned their own little genres. So let's talk about them. So first of all, let's talk about the one that I'm not including on the list. The one I'm not including on the list is Firefly. That's right. I'm starting with Firefly now so you can get your rage out. And the reason I'm starting with Firefly now is twofold. The first reason is that I'm not certain that it would be. I don't think there needs to be a reboot of it. The universe that was set up is quite good. It's quite an interesting universe. I think what I would prefer to see happen with that is, and this will have spoilers for a series which is quite old, so it's your fault if you haven't seen it yet, is I would instead have a kind of Firefly the Next Generation, where, I suppose it would turn out that Zoe and Wash had a child, right? That maybe Zoe was pregnant or whatever. And now that child is grown up and is inheriting Uncle Mal's ship or something along those lines. And then you could essentially reboot it and do it in a style that was more bingeable, a kind of more of an overarching story arc that wouldn't violate the original universe. You could do some fan service with cameos from the original cast who are still, the characters who are still alive. I suppose you could have flashbacks with the other ones, but they would look older than they had when they died in the series or movie, I suppose. But anyway, I actually don't think Firefly is a good candidate for this. Yes, I know everyone wants Firefly back, but guys, if it comes back, it will not be the same thing it was. It has to be a different thing. All right, so moving on from that. Farscape. Farscape is a show which was enormously popular on Sci-Fi Channel, but it got canceled because it just got so expensive to make. It was really at the end of practical effects. Henson Studios did all the aliens and whatnot, but it got very expensive, and when they canceled it, they replaced it with a lot of like scare tactics kind of shows where the ratings were nowhere near as good, but they were so much cheaper to make that they made a lot more money. Well, I think there are a couple things. Like, first of all, you could redo Farscape without the emphasis on practical effects and make them cheaper today. I think the other thing that you could do if you rebooted it would be there's also, I think, more of a hunger for practical effects now than there was, at that time. That was a time when I think practical effects were starting to just seem cheesy looking to people. But today, I think people find the weightedness of them, the way that they really don't appear painted on the screen, but appear part of the action, to be very appealing. So you might be able to get away with spending more money to do the practical effects in the same way that the original Farscape was. So Farscape would be the first one on my list. Probably the one that I think, if I looked in time, is probably the one that's most recent, is Dollhouse, the Joss Whedon Dollhouse. And yes, I know I've been very critical of Joss Whedon's work in the past. And frankly, I don't think the first season of Dollhouse is all that great. Nor would I recommend binging it. It's okay to watch, I suppose. But later on, it gets into this kind of apocalyptic world where after things have gone wrong with the Dollhouse technology, what happens then? That, I think, is an idea having to do with issues of identity that would give all sorts of really interesting opportunities for interesting story writing, for interesting acting and things. If you've seen the series, you know what I'm talking about. In the very last, the very end, when things have become post-apocalyptic, I think the post-apocalyptic Dollhouse would be a really good sort of gritty, bingeable reboot. In point of fact, since it is post-apocalyptic, it wouldn't have to be a reboot. You could really just say everything that happened in the series already happened. These are completely different characters in that world. All right, here's a big one. Sliders. Now, Sliders feels very late 80s, early 90s, if you look at it. But like some other series, like, say, for example, the Stargate series, there's a premise in it that just opens itself up to so many possibilities when it comes to storytelling. So and Sliders is a series about essentially sliding between different alternate realities, and every episode, or almost every episode, would take place in a different alternate reality. Later on, they attempt to have a sort of broader story arc. I actually think that having entire seasons or parts of seasons happening in reality, finding ways to create other sorts of long-term conflicts. I think there are ways that you could turn Sliders into something which would be very bingeable, where it allows for all sorts of twists where the characters and the viewer does not know some reality of this new world that seems so similar to our own, where just when everything seems lost, they slide to a new reality where they have a possibility of escape, or just where they seem like they've finally succeeded, they slide to reality where everything that they've tried to do is now falling flat. Another one which has sort of been redone, I think, would be Alien Nation. Now, Alien Nation, they've tried to redo once again. There was a pretty good show which was along similar lines not too long ago, called Defiance, which I do recommend. Defiance is different enough, by the way. I think that would also be another series. It's too recent to make my list as its own standalone item, but I do think that Defiance would be, could really work in the bingeable world. And then, this Netflix Will Smith movie Bright clearly was a descendant of Alien Nation. Again, I feel like a standalone movie is not right for this idea. I think a series of the kind, a series would be a good idea. And of course, Alien Nation was originally a pretty good movie, which was then okay series. And I think that is a kind of property that you could really return to. The Prisoner is a tough one. I think The Prisoner, which they've tried to redo, I think The Prisoner would definitely be bingeable. It has a real problem, though. And the real problem with The Prisoner is it's very much sort of bound into Cold War paranoia. I think there are two options if you were to redo The Prisoner. One option would be to take it out of the Cold War and make it about contemporary paranoia. And I would argue that that's been done and done really well, but without the prison. And that would be Mr. Robot. Like, conceptually, Mr. Robot gets at the idea of what The Prisoner would be if you were to update it. The other option would be simply to make it a period piece, to, a la Americans style. It's late 60s. And there's a spy, and these things happen, and it would be interesting because you could actually it wouldn't even have to be science fiction to us. It could be technologies which we know would have been developed in the next 10, 20 years after that, but they've already got a prototype or something at that time, which is working well, and the characters in there aren't able to do it. There are probably other ways, but The Prisoner is just such a fantastic series, would be fantastically bingeable if it were, remade for us today. And I think it would also be a delight if you wouldn't have to keep the exact same, color palette and costume and set design, but a very distinctive look to the village. I think would also just be wonderful. One which is not as well known, but I think would be really good, is Space Above and Beyond. Now, Space Above and Beyond was this short live series in the 90s, I'm going to say, maybe late 80s. And to be honest, it was actually less science fiction and more of just kind of general war series. But I think a very kind of combat-heavy sort of flyboy series like Space Above and Beyond, where you were able to create these sort of longer story arcs. I think that you could really do something. I mean, it's a really good series, and I think you could do something really, really nice in the Bingeable world. If you haven't seen Space Above and Beyond, I do recommend watching it, but it is far less about this. It's not really it's basically a war show with a thinly veiled layer of science fiction over it so they can do what they want with it. And the last one I think might be the most controversial one, not at first, but later on when you think about it, and that is Quantum Leap. Now, Quantum Leap, which had when it was at its worst, was when it was preachy. And we live in an extraordinarily moralistic and preachy age. Quantum Leap, if you were to just pick it up and say, let's redo this, would be the most insufferable, disgusting show, which at best would be done well. If you were to say, do it as a parody of, I suppose, woke culture or something. However, I think the science fiction concept is really very, very interesting. Less for the social commentary of each episode, where it's now we're going to deal with another issue, because it was very much a kind of issue of the week show. But more, if you could essentially have him leaping into a much more limited set of characters. Each one who's part of a different puzzle, part of a different, puzzle where, let's say, there's a, take a kind of 24 style, mystery where there's a conspiracy and there's danger. And as and for some reason, your main character is leaping into the bodies of all these different people and inhabiting them, but without the particular knowledge that comes from it, and just knowing how people respond to them, and is trying to save the world or save themselves or just get back to their own body or whatever it is, while following through all these different people, and maybe at some point inhabiting people who are liars or traitors, but they're only getting clues of that by living through this person's life without having inside information about them. Quantum Leap, I think, is one which could be rebooted in this worst, most terrible, insufferable way. I suppose Sliders and Alienation are also susceptible to that. But I think also it has this potential to really get into some interesting storytelling and a kind of Rashomon sense of, if you think of Quantum Leap, of rebooting it as the spiritual successor of Rashomon, I think then you could come up with something that was really very interesting, very intriguing, and would appeal to all sorts of people. Okay, so there should be enough here for nerd rage across the internet. Feel free to comment and tell me how beautiful my 14th century chaperone looks, and how intimidated you are by it, and also your opinions, why you think I'm wrong, and other shows that you would add to this list, or modifications you would add to this. So, until next time, minions.